They maintain this silence out of fear. The reputation has to come first. We are purposely isolated.
The founder of the Illuminati, 1776, what was the goal? Well, what he said was enlightenment of man. But if you read between the lines, no, forget that. Just read and listen to what he said. It was a one world government, a theme that continues to this day. Now, does that mean it's the Illuminati today, or is it just that there's this common view that the elite know better than the masses, and what's good is determined by a few? Now today, look no further. I don't worry about the Illuminati. I don't worry about the Bilderberg so much. I don't worry about the Freemasonry. I worry about who's in our face on the news every night. The World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization, the United Nations, the American presidency. These are corrupt organizations. Listen to Obama talk about in a speech how the common people are not able to dictate what's best for them. How can we let organizations continue to try and dictate how the masses should live? So whether or not these organizations are part of the original Bavarian Illuminati, that remains to be seen. But what we do know is that those very ideals are being pursued to this day.
Even more fascinating to many people than the Freemasons, who, are real, you can't deny their reality, and in some ways more frightening, more insidious, are the Illuminati. So you're allowed to talk about the Illuminati. And the Illuminati just aren't some people, some weirdos at a lodge doing things you don't approve of. No, the Illuminati apparently are the people who some people think run the world, or want to run the world. An evil, insidious, universal conspiracy bent on world domination.
When you talk about the agenda of the New World Order, again, not speculating, taking what they're actually saying and what their policies they're proposing are about, you're called a racist, you're called right-wing, an extremist. But what we're seeing is a very concerted effort to break down family values, the introduction of things like Trans Day on Easter Sunday, 15-minute cities, the ability to not have a choice about what you put in your arm or not if you want to keep your job. And the control that the agenda is trying to implement is underway with the theme of it's selfish to think about your individual rights. You're selfish. That's not being selfish. It's just there's nothing that we have in this world that hasn't been taxed. And if you look at what they're trying to achieve, it's clearly a totalitarian one world government. It's not an extremist speculation. It's actually the words that they're saying and the policies that they're administering. Not only were accused of performing satanic rituals back when they were originally founded, sort of the 18th century and into the 19th century. And thus they went underground, right? They were getting a lot of abuse, as most secret societies were. But people still attributed their presence to things like the French Revolution, the Battle of Waterloo, the assassination of JFK, the pedophilia in Hollywood. All these things get attributed subvertly to the Illuminati. Whether real or imagined, it is a catch-all scapegoat for anything nefarious.
The real Illuminati, if you want to find them in a place and time in history, is in the late 18th century, same period as the French and American revolutions, and in Bavaria. Okay, wasn't even Germany, it's just in southern Germany, in Bavaria, and you have the Bavarian Illuminati, or as it was also known, the Order of Perfectibilists.
Some members of the elite are corrupt. Surprise, surprise. And they belong to secretive organizations. These individuals exploit their power to engage in
unethical practices shielded by the confidentiality of their organizations. For instance, Freemasonry, with its secret rituals and meetings, provides the perfect cover for these activities, while groups like the Illuminati and the Bilderberg Group also convene discreetly to discuss global strategies.
I started my policing career as a uniform officer in the ghettos of southeast London. I then progressed to the West End. From there, I got offered a position, a really elite position, to join the ancient thing of policing on the River Thames. It was the first police unit ever in the world, and that was the Thames Police of London. I always wanted to join this unit, as I wanted, my main aspiration was to become a diver. I love swimming, I love diving, and I thought that I could join this unit as a patrol officer, relinquish my detective status, go back to uniform patrol, and then eventually become a diver. And that would also help with my parenting, as I had 4 young children at home, and it was quite tight working shift patterns, and especially on investigations. And one day I was approached by the sergeant, the detective sergeant that ran the intelligence unit for the division. And he said to me, "John, what are you doing working here?" He said, "You're more of a street copper, more of a hands in pockets merchant." He said, "I could do with someone like you for a sensitive inquiry." I decided to help him, but I had to use the utmost of discretion. And what the job was tracking down transient paedophiles that had escaped the provisions of the Sex Offenders Registry Act, which came out in 1997, requiring all sex offenders, if they were convicted, cautioned, or released from serving a prison sentence for sex crimes, that they had to sign at a local police station what's known as a Sex Offenders Register. So basically the police would know all their movements and be able to monitor them. But there was a loophole, and intelligence had come from the prison system that the best way to avoid any interaction with the police and signing this register was to go and live on a canal boat. The information that had been received by the Scotland Yard's Central Paedophile Unit, that there were 2 paedophiles living on canal boats within the London area, and my job was to track down 2 more, if possible, and that was seen as a heavy task in the next month. If that was achieved, then they would be very, very happy. Within a month, instead of finding 2, I'd found 90 paedophiles living on the inland walkway network of London, all of which had failed to sign on the Sex Offenders Register. This information was fed back to Scotland Yard's Central Paedophile Unit, and they were flabbergasted. What was put together was a national operation to extend this further out of London, and for me to keep looking for more sex offenders. So I'd go to these national intelligence meetings, and it really opened my eyes to the sheer extent of paedophilia. I'd never really given it much of a thought, and didn't think it was a major issue. And I started working with one detective who had basically spent his whole policing career at Scotland Yard investigating paedophilia. And he used to start to tell me stories of people very high up in the entertainment industry, in government, in education, that are actively involved in organised child abuse and organised paedophilia. And I started to realise that this is the line of business where you can actually really make a difference.
Oftentimes, the American political system has been accused of being short-sighted. American presidents are in office for 4 years. The next president, maybe 8 years, but typically 4, right? Next president comes in, undoes what the last one did. Now, compare that to China, who has a 50-year plan, and a 100-year plan, and a 300-year plan. I, however, don't think the US is that short-sighted. I think they have a plan, and it's a long-term play, and it goes way beyond the term of a president. But it's a club. Look at Julian Assange. 98% of the political structure in the US is corrupt. Now, I believe that in the 60s, there was a concerted effort to create a counterculture. Wonderful bands, some of my favorite, The Doors, all these sort of bands. Look at who the parents were of the band members. They're in the CIA. They're in other covert societies. And they're kind of creating this tune in, drop out, take some acid, begin to kind of move away from the traditional family values, introduce feminism, introduce abortion, introduce these things that begin to kind of pit us against each other. So where did this concerted effort to break down family values start? If you mention a phrase like I just did, you're accused of being a right-wing racist. I grew up in Chicago, Illinois, a blue state, a Democrat my entire life. No, I'm not a right-wing racist. But this probably, this sort of intent of breaking down the family values probably started in the UK. I mean, with the Britpop invasion and a lot of the sort of then radical kind of lifestyles that were being introduced, not only just in Britain, but across Europe, later adopted in the US, and I would say accelerated from there.
So what does Illuminati mean? It's Latin. It means enlightened. It's exactly the same thing. Okay, if you translated Illuminati into English, it simply becomes enlightened. If you're an Illuminatus, which is the singular of it, then you're just enlightened. And if you're the Illuminati, you're a bunch of enlightened people. That's all that it means. The Bavarian Illuminati come into existence, we know the day that they were formed, the 1st of May, 1776. That is when a professor of law at the Catholic Jesuit-run Ingolstadt University in Bavaria founded, along with 5 other men, his Order of Perfectibilists, aka the Illuminati. That term had been used many times before. I mean, how many times before? Well, let's put it this way. In the early Christian church, someone who was baptized was, guess what? An Illuminatus. Anyone who was initiated into any of the mystery religions, the spiritual secret societies of the Roman Empire, the Eleusinian mysteries, the Icaean mysteries, all of those people became, guess what? An Illuminatus. Illuminati had been around in one form or another as any people who were somehow generally accepted into a secret society that purported to give special information or doctrine which you were recruited into and in which you were initiated, and upon initiation you became enlightened. So you see, here again we encounter this thing that has this mysterious name, and yet when you decode the mysterious name, what do you find? Nothing. It's not mysterious at all. It means, because it says you're enlightened. Enlightened to what? What's the Enlightenment? Okay, what's the big secret? There was a nominally Islamic secret society in what's now Afghanistan in the, around 1700s, 1600s called the Roshaniya. What does Roshaniya mean? Enlightened. They believed in a kind of perfectible world. Everything would be turned into a single order, a communism of goods, equality of men and women, the whole business, no master above, no servant below. Why is it when we want to create a better world, and I'm not just talking about the communists, I'm talking about the French. What did the French Revolution stand for? What was it? Liberty, equality, and brotherhood. By the way, those things, liberté, equality, and fraternité, was the motto of a Masonic lodge in Paris. That is a Masonic motto, which was adopted for the French Revolution. So why would you argue with that? Need I say, if you tend to look at the communism for all of its great goals, almost everywhere it came into power ended up with a bloodbath. Is that because it's an idea that is inherently flawed? Or is it an idea which is consistently sabotaged? Okay, that can never be allowed to come into being. Is the flaw within ourselves? Is it simply because human beings cannot actually manage to come up with a workable system other than one based upon exploitation and brutality? Or is it because we're constantly diverted and this is always in some ways consciously sabotaged by some other purpose? And in some ways these movements are thrown up to divert us away from something else. That's the big question, I suppose.
When you think about it, it is so much easier to control the media, the television channels, the newspapers. They're all owned by the same 6 families. And if you just take 10 minutes and investigate it, you realize that's a lot easier to do than one thinks it is. And if you look at how bands from the 50s and 60s and 70s migrated and became sort of constructed by their parents who were members of the CIA and all these covert organizations. And you look today at some of the biggies in the entertainment world. Bob Dylan, to what does he attribute his success? Satan. To these stories, Katy Perry, you have all these people who were Sam Smith. They were this way, not very successful, and now they're this way. And it's so clearly satanic. It's not even tongue-in-cheek. It's just pure, unadulterated evil is how it looks, right? And there's stories from whistleblowers who talk about the fact that you'll take the master of a record and you'll bring it into a studio and you perform rituals on it. And there's sacrifices. And, you don't just need Mel Gibson or Estevez to tell you that Hollywood is a place where children are sacrificed. Why are they sacrificed? They're tortured. And that adrenaline, when they're being tortured, produces adrenochrome. And adrenochrome is an elixir that gives you prolonged youth. And this, allegedly, and when you look at it, it's a dark, dark subject. Everyone who attempts to make a documentary about it, whether it's Anthony Bourdain or whomever, commits suicide.
Whilst a uniformed police officer on jailer duties, and there was a big epidemic in London in the early 90s of crack cocaine and heroin abuse. And a lot of the burglars and street robbers had heroin addictions, and to fund it, they would commit violent crimes involving theft. And I was speaking to one guy that was in for burglary. He was a heroin addict, and I said to him, what is it with heroin? Why'd you do it? It seems crazy. And he said to me, son, if you'd have had my life, you'd be doing it. And I didn't understand, I didn't comprehend. And he then told me that he'd been brought up in a children's home and had been sexually abused. And when he takes heroin, it takes all the emotional pain away. And he said, you'll find a lot of people like me, they've come from the same background. What happened with one of the inquiries I was looking at, a boat had been named, and on this boat there'd be parties would be held, and it was in the upriver, more affluent part of West London. And the names of the people were quite shocking. There was someone high up in the British education system, there was someone with political connections, and there were allegations that they were taking young boys from a quite prestigious boarding school and they were sexually abusing them. Within a day, I was approached by this senior paedophile detective, and he said to me, John, in any form of policing, when you do incredibly well, you're rewarded, you're promoted, you're elevated. In this world, the opposite happens. And he said to me twice, we had the Home Secretary, which is one down from the Prime Minister, and a person involved in crime and justice as a full governance for the criminal justice system, for the courts, for the policing, etc. So we had this person twice for allegations of abuse on young boys, and on both occasions the funding was stopped. Be very, very careful of being good in this sort of world. And he said your name is already starting to get mentioned in the corridors. A day after that was said to me, a senior officer on the river unit dragged me to one side and said, John, unfortunately we can't afford to second you out anymore. I told the senior officer that I could no longer work under his command if that was the case. And a job had come out working with the vice unit, and it was involving prostitution, and it would give me back my detective status. I had to apply for it through the official channels, and this is where my first glimpse of secret societies comes in, because the senior officer said to me, show me the advert, and it came out in a notification, and the internal jobs would be on there with all the criteria, and it would be a reporting officer that you need to contact with in order to show an interest. I showed this senior officer this notice, and he said, I know this guy, he's in my lodge. He then rings this senior officer up, and he says to him, look, I've got one of my boys wants a job there, he's a good kid, I'm going to sponsor him, it'd be nice if he was to get this job. He put it on speakerphone, and the senior officer from the vice unit at the other end said, well, if he's listening, tell him to get down pen and paper and write the following things down. He gave me every question and every answer that I was going to be asked in the interview. On top of that, I would have a recommendation go with me. Lo and behold, I turned up for the interview. I did best out of every single applicant, and I got the job. My duties included going out onto the streets of London and really rounding up and prosecuting street prostitutes. When I got to meet these girls, every single one had the same story. They were all harbouring very heavy crack cocaine and heroin addictions. They were all had life-threatening illnesses such as contagious hepatitis, tuberculosis and AIDS, HIV, every single one. They had all been brought up in the so-called United Kingdom's care system. Every single one had been sexually abused at home, put into care and been sexually abused in care. But one night on vice patrols, I came across a young girl. She was 14 years old. She was underweight, she was on heroin, she was on crack cocaine, she was small anyway. She looked about 9, and she was prostituting herself on the streets at 2, 3 in the morning in a very high crime rate area. I took her into protective custody and put her in the car, and I radioed through to the control room. I was told by my supervising officer to throw her out and tell her to F off. The reason being that this girl had scabies, a contagious mite, skin mite, and if I brought her in, that would infect the car, and it would also infect the secure room that we would put these young kids in. I refused to throw the girl out and took her into protective custody, and I was reprimanded for it. A few days later, I was asked to go and speak to a little girl that was in a children's home. She was 14 years old. She had alleged that she was one of the child prostitutes, and she had something to tell. She said she was being pimped out. My briefing was, go and see this girl. She's probably lying. She keeps making this allegation. We think it's malicious. Just get rid of her. She told me that her mother was a heroin addict, and her mother would buy drugs off another prostitute, and that prostitute would then take the girl in exchange for the drugs, and she would then take her to a hotel, give her heroin, crack cocaine, and make her have sex with grown men. She said, it's not just me, John, there's others, and she gave me the name of another girl. I genuinely believed this girl. She gave me the name of another girl. I went and visited her. She told me the same. She in turn gave me the name of another girl, and on it went. This thing snowballed. Eventually we had nearly 36, it may be an exact figure, but around that, young girls, and there was a couple of boys, all the same story, all from the care systems, all being picked up, and the pattern was the same. Late evening to early hours of the morning, were taken to the most affluent part of London, that's Mayfair, and they were traded for £2,000 a time. They started giving me information about the clients. That involved a local judge, a senior officer, someone high up in the music department of the BBC, and many other names. I put these names on an intelligence report and submitted it. Within an hour of putting this report on, I was dragged before the senior officer that ran the unit. This guy went on to become one of the most senior police officers in the United Kingdom and was even knighted. He turned around to me and he said, John, what the F in hell have you done? This can never ever get out. If you mention a word of this, we as a force, we are effed past, present and future. This must never ever get out. And the most important 3 things he then said to me: if you do continue to speak out about this, you are going to lose your home, your children and your job. Now that's quite a claim, and he said it with confidence, and it rocked me to the core. He said, any job, again, the second time this has happened in a very short period of time, any job you want, you're going to get. I'll make sure of it. I've been told, given assurances to offer you any job. And I said, I still want to carry on working with children. I knew it was the only way in policing that you would make a difference. And he said, okay, but you must give me a gentleman's agreement. And he offered out his hand to me. And he said, you must never, ever look into child prostitution again. And I shook his hand. Okay, so I was moved. They scaled down the operation from 36 children to 2 children. Both of those 2 children ended up dead in mysterious circumstances, both of them.
There appears to be an epidemic of gargantuan proportion of child manipulation for the purposes of harvesting adrenochrome. So if NASA is a complete and utter fraud, they've never been to the moon, it was Stanley Kubrick, where is all that money gone? And why can't you go back to the moon all these decades later? You lost the technology? Really? Look at the photos of that whole... So the point is, all this money, where has it been going all these decades? Deep underground military bases, perhaps. This is where these children are kept. This is where this industry exists. And if you look in recent times where cargo ships like Evergreen get derailed, and you look at what the whistleblowers are saying, there's children inside those containers, and adults tied to the side of the wall, and they're being harvested, not just for organs, but for their blood. We're living in a world, whether it's a simulation or not, that is far darker. And going back to Canaanite times, this is nothing new, but how have we not seen it? They call it broadcasting for a reason. They only show us what they want us to see. The media just plays us as pawns. They're talking now about disclosure. There's UFOs. Okay, great, that's interesting, but tell us who was on Epstein's client list. Why is there a member of the royal family as a buddy of Epstein? And so Prince Andrew, this goes right to the very top. The royal family in the UK, there's photos of Ghislaine Maxwell and Epstein on the porch of the Queen's home in Scotland. Epstein made 20-some appearances in the Clinton White House. Can you explain that? So this is not just child trafficking. If it was, how horrific is that kings and queens and presidents are involved? But why are the children being trafficked? And if you look at that, and you look into the adrenochrome, then it gets very dark indeed, and it's something that needs to stop.
The mistrust that this has created in the general public is further exacerbated by the fact that numerous private detective agencies have called these individuals and their organizations out time and time again, thus underscoring to the general public that their worst fears have been substantiated.
I decided to hold a meeting of all concerned relevant agencies, parties and authorities. A very high up member of one of the 2 leading children's charities stopped me in my track and told me I shouldn't be looking into it. I was treading on toes and I had to shut down the inquiry immediately, and she said she would be reporting me to a senior officer. That led me into a state of panic because I'd been threatened with the home and the loss of my children. I then, at this point, received information about my 2 witnesses from the previous case. One in particular, that they've been found dead in different locations, different times. But when I heard, the more recent girl who was my key witness, it put me into a state of shock. I then made an allegation of corruption against this senior officer. The police wouldn't take it seriously. After 3 attempts, I was granted an audience with a senior female detective, and that was my request because I would not see a male detective. She said, why? And I said, because, ma'am, you cannot roll up your trouser leg. And it made her laugh. Now, what I was referring to there was a first-degree Masonic ritual when an entered apprentice is initiated into Freemasonry, that they have to do the ritual with their trouser leg rolled up. Now, this may sound conspiratorial. There was a major government inquiry called the Hillsborough Inquiry involving the football club Sheffield, when there was a terrible incident at this ground in Hillsborough where many people died. The investigation was deliberately covered up because of police incompetence and malpractice by Masonic interference, and that became official when they held the government inquiry. Every officer, every detective that was to go on that inquiry from an outside force other than local Yorkshire force of Hillsborough had to swear and make a statement that they were not involved in Freemasonry. So again, this is not conspiratorial at all. It has obstructed many an inquiry to such a degree that now, when they're held, officers have to make a declaration that they are not connected to Freemasonry. So I made this allegation of corruption and malfeasance in a public office, which carries a life sentence. I was taken seriously and told the investigation would be investigated thoroughly, and I was given vulnerable and intimidated witness statement, which means I was protected. Soon as the allegation was taken, the Metropolitan Police handed the inquiry over to a national crime agency. They in turn, instead of investigating it, they rang up the senior officer involved and said to him, John Wedger's alleged that you have covered up child prostitution. He said, no, I didn't, and they accepted that without interviewing him, without investigating anything, without looking at any of the evidence, and then they shut the inquiry down. In doing so, I lost my protective status. As soon as I lost my protective status, the Metropolitan Police had then handed this investigation over to the National Crime Agency, who then went on to finish it. They boshed it, they quashed it, they stopped investigating it. There was no further action. I was then subject to a monumental bullying campaign. My wages were withheld. I went sick. I was meant to be on full pay. I went straight away almost onto no pay, so I had no income for nearly 3 years. I was arrested on 9 occasions for 9 separate offences. These ranged from theft of an A4 sheet of paper up to threats to kill and even Class A drug supply. The banks came to really take away, doing a financial assessment on me with a look at taking away my home because I couldn't pay my mortgage. So bear in mind the threats, I was to lose my home, my job, my children. In amongst this very low point in my life, one of my children, one of the 4 children that I was bringing up on my own, was involved in a horrific life-altering accident. His spinal column was severed by 96% at a very high level on his vertebrae. He was in hospital, he was in a coma. His life expectancy was almost non-existent. I was called to the hospital one day. I didn't even have enough petrol in my car to get there. I got there on fumes. I was met by 3 consultants who took me into a side room and they said, "We're ever so sorry, Mr. Wedger, but your son went into cardiac arrest. He's been dead for 10 minutes. We worked on trying to resuscitate him for 7.5 minutes. Unfortunately, there's nothing we can do." They managed to get a minor brain algorithm which warranted him time, the maximum amount of time on full life support, which was 5 days. His lungs were being fully inflated by 100%, which mean that his alveoli, the little pockets, the transfer the oxygen into his bloodstream, it would burst due to the pressure, and it would render them almost useless. So 5 days was a maximum amount of time they'd give him. So I accepted the 5 days. I told them I had no reason to appeal it, and I believe that they did everything that they could to resuscitate him and keep him in a good state. I stayed at the hospital for 3 days by his side. On the 3rd day I went into the chapel. I prayed to God, and I prayed to God for my son, and I offered myself up to Jesus Christ, that I'm prepared like him, the shepherd, to go after the one lost sheep, and leave the flock behind. But I said I can't do it unless I get my kid back. I said, please give me my child back, and I will do everything I can to help the lost sheep. I went back and I kissed my son, and I told him goodbye, and in doing so he opened his eyes. He then moved his left foot. I then asked him to grab my hand with his left hand. He did that, and did likewise with his right hand. I then hugged him and told him I loved him, and he mouthed back saying he loved me too. I informed my colleague to tell the investigating team to leave me alone, because I wasn't in the right state of mind, and especially if my son was to die, then I would want vengeance on the police. When I got home, I was confronted by 2 detectives who were outside my house. They then arrested me for child abandonment, saying that I left my 15-year-old son home alone without any food whilst I was by my dying son's side. So instead of showing me any sort of compassion, you know, this is what they want. They wanted to take my youngest boy into care. He was at home alone with my 23-year-old, so there was no offences caused. I then told the police that they need backup, because if anyone touches my children, that I would bite lumps out of them. There's no way that they were getting out without major injuries to both of them. One of the officers, he actually asked me to explain what had gone on, and I told him. And he then told me that they'd actually been lied to, that the police had told my local force that I'd left my son in a state of abandonment and neglect, which was an absolute lie. But at that point something had changed in me. I began to have the fortitude and the strength to fight back, and I made a pact with God that I would go out there and I would help. Within a few months, every single case that they had against me was put before the Crown Prosecutor, the government solicitors and barristers, to see whether it was viable to prosecute. Every single case was thrown out as no case to answer. The police then paid my pension, and they paid back all the money they took off me over the 3 years, and I was able to retire in peace. What I did then was use my abilities as a specialist investigator and an interviewer and an integrator to go out there and set up a project called The Voice for the Voiceless. Using my iPhone, I went and I spoke to victims and survivors of historic child abuse, especially from the care homes. I was inundated. My first interview got 2.2 million hits. I started getting contacted by serious and organised criminals and ex-criminals. One of the guys, one of the ex-criminals, become a very close friend of mine, and he said, John, there's one thing you're missing out. You need to start talking about a topic that no one's talking about, and that is the topic of satanic ritual abuse. And he told me that his sister had endured it while she was in a kids' home. She was taken to venues at night where hooded, masked people, men and women, would lay her down and commit atrocities on this girl. When we start looking at why does the government not do something about this? We get the same thing. A child, if it's divested from its mother and placed in an abusive environment, is going to get massively damaged. A survivor of abuse can go on to function very well academically.